You're watching City Channel 4, your window to our community.
I want to thank Harry and all the organizers of the 26th anniversary celebration for ADA. It's an important event, an important thing to celebrate. I'm happy to be here. So on behalf of the city of Iowa City, maybe the people of Iowa City, it's my great pleasure to be able to introduce Ty Tomasi. So it's my understanding that Ty graduated from the University of Iowa's Law School about 2 years ago, and she currently works as a staff attorney for Disability Rights Iowa in Des Moines. So it's a major position to be in, and I'm really thrilled that she's down here to speak to us. And Ty, it's my understanding that you are sightless, and this makes me think of my very, very minor disability, but it's one that, in a sense, opens my eyes. I have macular degeneration in both of my eyes, but mostly in my right eye. So with each passing day, I become increasingly aware of how my own eyesight is deteriorating. And then that makes me think of people who were either born sightless or because of some progressive disease of some kind or some other event are really fully sightless, and how difficult it can be for such a person to get around, to navigate our city. We have construction sites all over the place. So I'm imagining it's very difficult at times to be able to navigate those construction sites while being sightless. And a few days ago, I saw a friend who's confined to a wheelchair trying to navigate his own way across one of the wooden sort of bridges we have in that construction space, and saw how difficult it was for him to move around. So we've been able to do a lot in Iowa City over the years, but we have a lot more to do. I'm happy that Simon Andrews, our ADA coordinator, and he's helping us keep on track, but we have a lot more to do, and I know Harry and all the other folks who are friends of Harry's and friends of Iowa City are doing the same kind of thing. So with all that, I'd like to welcome you, Ty. It's great to see you, and I look forward to everything you have to say. Please join me in welcoming you.
Thanks so much, Mayor Throgmorton. I wanted to let some people know if you're blind or have a visual impairment, the earlier referenced things, that is the refreshments and the sign-in sheet, are to the left of the room if you're facing the front. And if you're in my orientation, then it would be to your right. So just so you're aware. I would like to know a little bit more about the audience that I'm speaking to. So if you could help me out, if you are a person with a disability and are okay with identifying yourself as such, please clap or make some other noise. All right, we got some. Okay, great. All right, if you are a professional or someone who works with people with disabilities, please make yourself known with an audible signal of some kind. Excellent. If you're a parent or a guardian of someone with a disability, please make yourself known. Excellent. Be proud. So I'm glad to be here to acknowledge the 26th anniversary of a very important law to those of us with disabilities and those who don't have disabilities. As I like to point out, the things that help people with disabilities end up helping everyone. When there's a curb cut, it helps people that use strollers. When there is other accessible means of things, it certainly helps other populations that you might not even think of. Harry did a great job of recognizing all of our sponsors. I want to thank them personally for their help with this presentation today. I want to go through a little bit of different laws that affect individuals with disabilities. And by the way, if you want to speak, please make yourself known audibly by voice or by other means. I don't do well with raised hands. As you know, I can't see. I prefer the term blind. It's okay to say blind. It's not a bad thing to do. It's not offensive. So go ahead and call me what I am. I'm blind. It's okay. And identify yourself. So are we on the slide that says laws to protect individuals with disabilities? Am I in the right place? previous. Oh, I went too far. There we go. Better? All right, perfect. All right, so in 1973, we got Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. That was the first law that helped people with disabilities, at least in the modern days, and one that was comprehensive. And it allows for places who receive federal funding, they need not discriminate. They cannot discriminate against people with disabilities. There's a prohibition of that. Then we had the Individuals with Disabilities and Education Act. A lot of what we do at Disability Rights Iowa concerns special education and getting kids the rights and education that they need, the right to a free, appropriate public education. And that can include things like behavior problems, all kinds of different things that you might not think of, that some people may not identify as disabilities, but they definitely are disabilities, and those kids definitely need our assistance with them. We also have the Developmental Disabilities Assistance and Bill of Rights Act. And by the way, as I'm speaking, I know that I tend to speak very quickly. If anyone has difficulty hearing me, please let me know, and I will slow down, and I will enunciate my words. It's not out of nervousness, it's out of, I have so much information to share, and there's only a limited amount of time. Let's see. In 1986, we had the Protection and Advocacy for Individuals with Mental Illness Act. A huge number of the people that I serve are people with mental illness. There's a huge stigma in our society about mental illness, and people don't recognize it as a disability. And it is definitely a very disability that needs a lot of accommodation. Not extensive accommodation, really actually quite easy accommodations, but nevertheless, it is definitely something we need to address in our system, in our social services. And then we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was amended in 2008. And we also have Ticket to Work and different work incentives that help people go back to work. So these are work incentives that help people to be able to get off benefits or decrease their reliance on benefits. And then particularly pertinent this year in the election year is the Help America Vote Act. Although its funding is kind of leading off, there's not a lot of HAVA funding around. We still need to think about voting access and voting rights. And throughout the entire political process, I've heard at both the political conventions there's been problems accessing that part of the process for people with disabilities. And then locally, just how do we get people to the polls, and how do we allow them to use absentee ballots if they can't get to the polls, things like that. All right. Bear with me on this system. I'm working to learn how to use it. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, it was signed in 1990, as most of us probably know. It protects civil rights of people with disabilities, and the definition of disability was changed in 2008 when it was amended. So it was broadened quite a bit to allow for more people to qualify as people with disabilities. And the Department of Justice made new regulations that went into effect in 2011. So that has helped some in enforcing the ADA. Are we on goals? Yes. Okay. So under the ADA, the goals are, well, you can read this if you are able to read it, but if not, I will continue to articulate them. Clear, enforceable standards for equal treatment under the law. That's a really important thing. People equate it to sort of the Civil Rights Act. It's kind of the same idea, equity. Fairness to individuals, businesses, and the government. Independence and access. So we want diverse, integrated, welcoming societies for people with disabilities. That's very important. It's a very important value that Congress saw in creating this. There are 5 parts of the ADA. We have Title I, which covers employment. I take a lot of employment cases. There's a great deal of discrimination in employment. When I was 15 years old, I went to get my first job at a restaurant, and I dressed up in a crab costume and waved my claws around outside of the restaurant to get people to come into the restaurant. And, I was hired for that job. The person who interviewed me clearly thought that I could do that job. But when it came to someone coming back from vacation, manager comes back from vacation, decides that it's not safe for a blind person to do this job, and I was out of a job after 3 days. As a person with a disability who had been raised to think that I could do anything, that was pretty devastating. It was pretty devastating to learn someone didn't believe I could be in a crab costume. And a crab costume is not a hugely onerous task. It's not like you're, doing nuclear physics or something, right? So I thought, if I can't do this job and nobody's going to hire me to do this job, what job can I do? And, there was some depression there and some difficulty dealing with that. And that's at the point where I decided I was going to go into this field of law and try to help figure out how to make this a better process for people with disabilities. Then we have Title II, which deals with state and local governments. That allows for state and local governments, it's a prohibition on them discriminating against people with disabilities. We have Title III, which deals with public accommodations and commercial facilities, and I'm going to go through each of these in more detail later. Again, if you have questions or comments, please interrupt and make yourself known. Title IV deals with telecommunications, and Title V has miscellaneous provisions. So Title I, going back to employment. Let's see. I don't know. Let's see. So employers are not allowed to discriminate against people with disabilities because of those disabilities. People with disabilities aren't guaranteeing a job just because a person has a disability. So you're not guaranteed to get a job. You have to be able to do the job with or without accommodations. And that's the buzzword for Title I, reasonable accommodations. You have to be able to do your job. You have to be able to do the essential functions. So the things that are listed on a job description as essential, you have to be able to do those with or without an accommodation. And it has to be a reasonable accommodation. I've spoken with people who wanted everything to be changed, every single thing to be changed about their job. That's not a reasonable accommodation. So we have to be mindful of that. You can be terminated or fired from a job if you have a disability, if you're not doing your job. And under the ADA, you have the right to not be discriminated against in all employment practices. So everything has to be, all policies and practices have to be applied uniformly. So there can't be any difference in how you're hired, how you're fired, how you're trained. You can't be paid less because you have a disability. And that's been a really big one lately because there have still been some places that pay people with disabilities less than minimum wage. I'm not going to go into that in detail, but that's been a big part of my work is eradicating less than minimum wage. That's not okay to pay people with disabilities a non-living wage. You also can't be discriminated in promotions because of your disability or benefits or leave time. Those all have to be applied uniformly. Are we on definitions? All right. I think I'm getting this down. So if you're under the ADA, you have to be a qualified individual, which is a person who has a disability who, with or without reasonable accommodations, can perform the functions of the job. And your disability means that you have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity, or if you have a record of such impairment, or if somebody thinks you have this impairment. If someone, like say your employer, goes on the idea that you have an impairment and they treat you that way, you have an argument that there's been some disability-related, some acknowledgement of a potential disability, and so you have an ADA argument there. Like I talked about, if you're doing a job, you have to be able to do the essential functions, and that means a job requirement that's required to be performed. And if that job function were removed, it would totally change the job. It would be a different job altogether. That's what a essential function is. So you need to, the biggest chunk of my employment experience has been dealing with reasonable accommodation issues. And you need to tell your employer about your disability at certain times. You don't have to tell them if you don't need an accommodation. There's no requirement that you need to tell them. But if you need assistance to do your job, then you'll have to tell them about your disability to get the assistance you need and to explain why the disability requires that type of assistance. So you actually have to be able to explain, I have this disability, I need this particular assistance because of these things that happen to me with this disability. And that's what is known as a reasonable accommodation. Some people say, I never have to disclose a disability, I just can go in and I can ask for whatever I want, and that's not correct. You have to be able to explain the connection between what you want and your disability. But a reasonable accommodation can be any change. It can be an adjustment, it can be changes in the work environment, it can be a change in how things would would usually be done. For example, for me, there's a lot of visual things that I'm not able to do, so I work with an assistant to do those things. I have difficulty making copies because my copier is not accessible. There are things that individuals that use wheelchairs might have difficulty doing just in getting around, and so they might have an accommodation of a different workaround for those things, those work functions. You can also get reasonable accommodations in applying for jobs. Again, for performing an essential function, you can get an accommodation. You have to enjoy equal access to benefits that others get in your workplace, so there can't be any sort of discrimination on benefits or workplace. Let's talk about examples of reasonable accommodations. If there's a job restructuring, that could be an accommodation. You might be restructured. You might have a part-time or modified work schedule. You might be reassigned to a vacant position. Reassignment's been kind of a hot topic. Some circuits in the courts say, yes, must be reassigned immediately, and there's kind of a circuit split, which I think is going to come up soon in this area because of another case that may not continue to be the absolute law. There may be more with reassignment. There needs to be appropriate adjustment or modification of examinations, training materials, or policies. For example, if you're deaf, you need to have an interpreter provided. If you have some sort of intellectual disability, which is the appropriate term for mental disabilities, now you should be entitled to having those materials in a format that you can understand. So, commonly encountered accommodations might be breaks to take medications, leave to seek medical treatment or change medications, changing the work schedule, someone to drive to meetings or other work-related events. That's one that my employer has provided for me. I can get a driver to take me places if I need to go different places or read things for me. Sometimes people need to work at home. And this is a common thing. We're on the driver's license slide? Okay, so if driving is an essential function of the job, then the employer doesn't have to eliminate that from the position. So if you're a truck driver, clearly the employer doesn't have to change the requirement for you to drive. But you also have to review if an accommodation is available and also if it's reasonable. Driving isn't always a job function. It just may be a way to accomplish something. So I don't need to drive, I just need to get places in my job. So that's not an essential function. So we're talking about this example now. If you're a sales clerk and you want a promotion to be manager and you are not promoted, someone else is promoted, and the store claims that the essential function of driving is necessary to take the receipts to the bank. That's not an essential function. This is depositing receipts is the essential function. You need to deposit your receipts as a business establishment. So you need to find a driver that can take you there, and that would be a reasonable accommodation, to have a driver or have another employer take you or ride in a taxi. I use Uber quite a bit, or other transit providers. I don't know how Uber is received here in Iowa City. I hope that's not a buzzword here, but I use it. I use buses. I use other forms of transportation to get around. Requesting a reasonable accommodation is really easy. There's no magic word. You just tell your employer that you need something. You need an adjustment, you need a change because of your disability, and it's better to put it in writing, always. That's the buzzword of a lawyer. Put it in writing. And you should describe the disability and why you have a limitation that needs an accommodation. I have trouble with the word limitation because I don't really feel like there's many limits, but I understand that that can be a limitation, that you need some kind of accommodation. Sometimes you don't know what accommodation you need. And so that's where you engage in the interactive process with your employer to discuss possible accommodations. You say, hey, here's my problem I am having on the job. I'm not sure how to fix it, but I would like to talk to you about it. So when the accommodation is requested, then the employer and the employee and other personnel should sit and talk about what could work, what things could work. They can ask for limited medical documentation, but no one should feel compelled to give them their entire record. I tell my clients to minimize the amount you give to someone because that's private information, that's personal information. It's not necessary to have all of it, but it is necessary to have the stuff that is relevant to your disability. This process can take a little while, but you don't want the employer to unnecessarily drag it out. The duty to accommodate continues, and again, it has to be reasonable. You can't force your employer to do something that would be unreasonably expensive or anything like that. It doesn't have to be provided if, like I said, it's unreasonable. It requires like reallocation of essential job functions. That's not required. If the employee then is not qualified, if it is an undue hardship, so really expensive or just somehow in another way undoable, or if it's a direct threat to the health or safety of the employee or others. So for enforcement, there are state and local level laws. You can file a complaint with the Iowa Civil Rights Commission within 300 days of what happened of the discriminatory act. At the federal level, you can take the complaint to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission within 180 days. We help a lot with these cases at Disability Rights Iowa. So those are, and there are different deadlines for federal employees, age discrimination, Equal Pay Act, etc. So that's something you would consult the EEOC about. You can also go to court. You can request a right to sue letter within 60 days after filing with any of the different places I listed above. And once a right to sue letter is issued, then the case has to be filed in court in 90 days. And there's different types of relief you can get. You can get equitable relief, which is hiring, promotion, things on the job, reinstatement to your position. You can get damages, which would be compensatory damages. You can get punitive damages, which is basically to punish the employer, but that only applies to intentional discrimination. It's very hard to prove intentional discrimination. You can also get attorney's fees and court costs. Does anybody have any questions about Title I so far? I'm going to move on to Title II. Or does anybody have any unrelated questions so far? I don't want to talk for 2 hours. I really want to interact somewhat. I'm not really sure how to do that, but I would love your input. So if you have any thoughts about questions that you have, it won't put me on the spot. I might tell you I don't know the answer, and I might have to email you after this, but I'm certainly welcome to entertain them. Great. Can you use the microphone?
Yes.
Thank you. Just want to make sure the recording can pick it up and anyone who has any hearing issues can hear you.
Thank you. I was just wondering about Title I. Do those employment provisions apply regardless of the nature of the employer? So, do they apply equally in the private sector and the public sector and, universities and state governments as much as with corporations and...
Yes, provisions of Title I apply to most employers. There are some exceptions for very small employers. However, in my experience, most employers want to comply. I believe it's less than 15 employees. You don't need to comply with the ADA, but I think most employers choose to. If they don't, it's generally they can be educated to where they can actually provide an accommodation that is not unduly burdensome for them. So, yes, it does apply. If you have an instance of discrimination with a federal entity, then you'd go to the EEOC directly and file your complaint there, because they take those.
Thank you.
I was just going to remind everybody also that the City of Iowa City has a Human Rights, Civil Rights Commission that people could file with also here locally. So you have the state and you have the EEOC, but you can also file locally.
Yeah, and the local civil rights and human rights commissions are very helpful. Those offices are very helpful in filing those complaints and walking people through the process. So Title II of the ADA covers state and local governments.
We do have one more question.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Hi, Ty. This is Monica Brackway, and I'm from Iowa Vocational Rehabilitation Services. So I just wanted to say hi to everybody and remind you all that we're a state agency, and we work closely with our job candidates on this issue and employment, providing accommodations and working directly with business and industry to educate them on ADA. So we're always a resource available.
Excellent, excellent. And I will put in a plug for vocational rehabilitation services. I am here today with the help of different vocational rehabilitation agencies that helped me through school and helped me find work. I'm a go-getter, so I didn't have too much trouble finding work, but some people do, and it is a difficult process, and it can be very soul-crushing when you don't find a job immediately. And there is still a lot of discrimination that it's not provable discrimination, but it's definitely there. People don't know how to deal with disabilities. So I commend all the partners at vocational rehabilitation agencies for improving that situation. So as far as state and local governments, there's the ADA Title II prohibits discrimination against qualified individuals with disabilities in programs, activities of federal and local state and local governments, services of public entities, and it applies to all state and local governments and their departments and agencies and any other instrumentalities or special purpose districts. So it's very comprehensive. It covers public transportation. And so the protections under this part of the law, governments have to make reasonable modifications to their policies, practices, and procedures to allow equal opportunity for individuals with disabilities to participate. Unless the only restriction again is if that would fundamentally alter the nature of the service, program, or activity. It provides, they have to provide auxiliary aids and services, integrated program access through non-structural and architectural modifications. So they have to do some modifying. They don't have to remove all physical barriers in existing buildings as long as the programs in those buildings are readily accessible to people with disabilities in another facility. So if they can move it somewhere else or they can provide the service in a different location in the building, then that would be okay. But all new construction has to be accessible. And there is sort of a myth that if you're an older business, well, this goes to businesses as well. I'll talk about that later, I suppose. Then we also have the Olmstead decision, which is a huge part of my work. I want to keep people in their homes. I want to keep people out of institutions. None of us would want to see ourselves in that position unless we chose to be there. And this decision, there were some women who were kept in an institution. Lois Curtis and Elaine Wilson, they had mental illnesses and they had developmental disabilities. They were voluntarily admitted to a psych unit in the Georgia hospital, but they had mental treatment, they had medical treatment, and mental health professionals said that they were ready to go to community-based placement, but the women remained in the institution for several years, and this is not uncommon. It still happens today. Due to budgetary concerns or lack of placement options or lack of money to have them in their homes and provide them services there, they're left in institutions. And this was the Supreme Court found this was unjustified segregation of people with disabilities, and it constituted discrimination in violation of Title II of the ADA. Public entities have to provide community-based services to persons with disabilities when the services are appropriate, when the affected people don't have any, when they don't oppose community treatment. So if the person doesn't want it, then obviously they're not going to ask for that treatment. They're going to want to stay in another place, hospital or institution. When those services can be reasonably accommodated, given the resources available to the public entities. And it's really led to huge changes. This decision's led to huge changes in how services are delivered and to people with disabilities. This is particularly interesting to me. I recently helped a client with this issue try to get home, and it was very difficult to get him home. Everyone didn't, people didn't necessarily know if the services were available. Some agencies err on the side of taking people out of their homes when they may be able to have services in their homes. So it's a very important piece of education for me to encourage all agencies, all people, to really put themselves in the shoes of someone with a disability and think, well, would I want to be in this place? Would I want to be in a hospital instead of in my home? And if not, how would I make these services available so that they can live in their homes? All right, are we on enforcement? Yes. All right. You can file a private lawsuit. You can get a court order to stop discrimination. You can get attorney's fees. There are no monetary damages here against governments. You can file a complaint with designated federal agencies, the Department of Justice, Department of Transportation. We file a lot of, well, at the state level, at least departments of education. You could file one at the federal level too. You can get monetary damages or civil penalties can be awarded. And let's see, other local options are you can get assistance with local issues you can get from these agencies. They can provide a quicker response getting resources at the state level. And so these would be the Iowa Civil Rights Commission again, and it talks about what they do. It's a neutral body helping out with civil rights issues. We have a website here. The Department of Human Rights, again, similar programs, ensuring equal access to government services under the ADA. We have a website for that as well. And if anybody wants this PowerPoint after, I'd be glad to send you information from the PowerPoint if you would like it in an accessible format. There's also the Iowa State Ombudsman's Office. So they are impartial agency to manage problems between citizens and government. And again, there's another website for them. Does anybody have any questions on Title II referring to state and local governments? Or any questions about? Oh.
I do just want to add that here in Iowa City, we have Access to Independence, which is another agency serving persons with disabilities that people also can contact, and they can Google their webpage online. And we have representatives here from them.
Great. And yeah, there are actually several independent living centers statewide. I believe there are 6. Is that correct? Is anybody aware? I think there's 6. And they provide local services and can help out. So that's a really good resource. All right, did I advance the slide yet? Are we on Title III? Yes. Okay. I can't keep track. It's hard to remember that. So Title III covers public accommodations, which is what I was going to talk about a little bit earlier. I jumped the gun there. So public accommodations are private entities that own, operate, lease, or lease to public places of accommodations. So they may be landlords or also commercial facilities, private entities offering examinations and courses related to educational certifications. They can include a lot of different entities. It can be they include restaurants, hotels, theaters, physician offices, daycare centers. I mean, the whole gamut of different places you would go that are privately owned, that are not government run, and that are not employers. I mean, they are employers, but you might be accessing them as a service, as a customer. So this part requires that that public accommodations provide goods and services in integrated settings, and that they eliminate unnecessary eligibility standards or rules that deny equal opportunity to enjoy goods and services. They have to modify their policies, practices, and procedures to allow people with disabilities to participate. So any policy that denies equal access, unless they can argue that it would be a fundamental alteration to change it. I think it's pretty hard for them to argue that, in most cases, that helping someone with a disability would pose a fundamental alteration, but I know that it's happened before. They have to furnish auxiliary aids when necessary to ensure effective communication. So if someone has difficulty hearing or they need something in an alternative format, the place of business should help them to receive that. They have to remove barriers if readily achievable. This is what I was going to get into earlier, is that a lot of businesses think that there's a grandfather clause, they're grandfathered into not having to make access changes. We don't have to fix anything in our business. That is not true. If they can do this in an inexpensive way and it's readily achievable, that's the key word. If it's readily achievable, then they have to make the change. If you're able to put in a ramp at your business, then you need to do so if asked to. Are we on examples? All right, so examples under Title III. It would be a violation if a store had a rule to exclude people who are deaf or people who are blind. It's just straight up discrimination. But when you get to the idea of kids in swim diapers, that may be a policy that needs to be changed for a person with a disability, if it's a child with a disability. There may be subtle instances of discrimination, like requiring a driver's license as the only form of ID for purposes of paying something, like with a check, if you're using a check. That discriminates against people with vision impairment who don't have alternate ID. I use a non-driver ID, so that wouldn't work for me. Most people just ask me for my driver's license, and I kind of laugh because I don't have one, but that's okay. I'll show them my non-driver ID, and it's great. Title III doesn't require them to modify things that would fundamentally alter their service, or if it was an undue burden for the person, for the place. It wouldn't be discriminatory for a physician who specializes in burn patients to refer someone to another physician for that specialty, like with a broken limb or something. If they have a certain specialty, they can refer elsewhere. And if a restaurant doesn't have a Braille menu, they're not required to have a Braille menu, because a waiter can read the menu, or another employee or a person that's with you at the restaurant can read it to you. However, here in Iowa, we have the Iowa Library for the Blind, who will actually put menus into Braille for you. So if you ever come to a restaurant and they don't have a menu, you can contact the Library for the Blind and submit the menu, and they will give the restaurant 2 free copies of the menu. I just learned that today. Thanks, Harry. I didn't know about that. Retail stores are not required to have sign language interpreters on staff if they're otherwise able to communicate with pen and paper or something similar. I have an interesting story about that. When I was in college, the person who was running the front desk was deaf, and we had quite a communication barrier. I had to get someone to be our interpreter to help me understand what the person was writing. So sometimes it takes teamwork to help everyone communicate well with each other. You have to make existing facilities. I kind of talked about this already. You got to make the physical barriers. You got to remove them. You got to do that if it's readily achievable, and that means if it's easy to accomplish, without a lot of difficulty or expense. Let's see, some examples of barrier removal: installing ramps, making curb cuts at sidewalks, rearranging tables and chairs. Mostly, a lot of the ones that I've seen have just been rearranging stuff. You got to change these tables around in this restaurant, or move these display racks. Those are not difficult things to do. You can also install grab bars in bathrooms, help out with that. So, can you tell what's wrong with these images? One of them has a really high mounted door with the handles really high up. This is not very visually accessible. I'm sorry. Let me try to describe these images. There's another one where the entryway ramp is really steep and it leads to a narrow and sharp turn. And then once you turn around that corner, your way is blocked by a handrail that goes up to the door. So even though there's a ramp, you still can't get into the business. I hope these pictures are up on the screen, are they? Yeah. Okay, good. If I'm off ever, tell me. Alternatives, there are alternatives if something isn't readily achievable to do. So there are alternate steps you can take to make things accessible or available. They might be, if your place is a really old building and you maybe need to provide goods and services at the door or sidewalk of your business. A friend of mine in a wheelchair just told me the other day she went to this awesome, what they call pop-up store. It's like a boutique, and they had all these awesome clothes, and she really wanted to go. but it was housed in a building where she couldn't get to. So they actually brought out all of the clothing one by one or on racks for her to see, so that she could participate in the program. And I thought that was a good compromise. It's not the best compromise. Of course, we want it to be accessible, but sometimes that's not available to us. Another one is to provide home delivery, retrieve merchandise from inaccessible racks, get staff to help you, relocate activities to accessible locations. I know that the University of Iowa is very good about doing that. If something is in an inaccessible place, they will move it to somewhere more accessible. Again, new construction or alterations, they have to be accessible. They have to be accessible to the maximum extent feasible when they're new. And they have to follow the accessibility guidelines. There's a whole set of those, and they're quite detailed. There are a couple different sets depending on when your building was built, but if it's new, you have to do it according to the new standards. And if you have a Title III issue with a business, with a private, you can file a private lawsuit. That you could get a court order to stop the discrimination. Again, you can get attorney's fees. There are no monetary damages. You can file complaints with state and federal agencies and in the U.S. District Court or Iowa District Court.
I have a question about parking for people with disabilities. I've noticed around Iowa City lately with all the construction, sometimes the construction workers block off the parking spaces that are for people with disabilities. I've noticed this at location at the University of Iowa, for example. And I just wondered, is that legal for them to block that off and just have it so there's no disability parking available in front of these buildings where parking is limited anyway?
No, I mean, they need to be mindful of the fact that they're blocking those. So I would definitely inform someone on the crew when you see them there, if you see someone there, and also let the physical plant know. I don't know what it's called at University of Iowa, physical plant or something, whoever deals with parking. They need to know that that's happening, and they need to pick it up, address it with the construction crew that's there. Of course, if it's city property, then the city would need to be informed about that. And I don't know if we have anything similar here, but I know that I believe in Cedar Rapids, there's an app that you can use, and maybe there's something similar. You can take a picture of an access barrier, and then you can send it to the city and show them, here's this blocked off sidewalk or this parking problem, so they're aware of it. That's definitely helpful, but definitely inform. I think the issue is that the word isn't getting to the appropriate people to stop that problem. Maybe the person on the construction crew isn't relaying that message. Oh, good. We have some authority here. He's going to tell us something.
I just want to mention that in Iowa City, you have two different ways of going about. One is contacting our ADA coordinator, Simon Andrew, at City Hall, or online at the ic.gov website. You can take and file the complaint with whether it be snow removal from curb cuts, trees hanging over sidewalks so that wheelchair can get through. Any number of things you can file a complaint with, and they act very quickly on it and will also send you back a response.
Excellent.
Sorry, really quickly to add to that too, there is a smartphone app. If you go to the website icgov.org that Harry just mentioned, you can submit those online, but there's also a smartphone app, ICGov Express, that you can snap a photograph of whatever issue you're encountering and it'll automatically route it to the right staff.
Excellent. I'm glad to hear that more cities are having these apps because it's really helpful when you're out there in the field to be able to snap a picture. All right, are we on service animals? All right, so under Title II and Title III, only dogs are recognized as service animals, although there are some provisions in the regulations for service miniature horses. The dog must be individually trained to do work or perform tasks for persons with a disability. These might include guiding, alerting people who have hearing loss, pulling wheelchairs, alerting people of seizures, that they're going to have seizures, reminding them to take medications, calming a person with anxiety or PTSD. If the only function of the dog is to provide comfort or emotional support, it's not considered a service animal under the ADA. However, under the Fair Housing Act, there are other provisions that allow for that. So they can live in your home with you as an emotional support animal, but they're not permitted in public places. And state and local governments and public entities don't have to accommodate those animals. Let's see. They have to. So Title II and Title III entities have to allow service animals in all areas where members of the public can go. So that can be even in hospitals, they have to allow dogs in. Sometimes people think, well, they can't be in a restaurant because there's food there. Well, no, that's not correct. The dog has to be under control of the person. And if the dog is not under control, it can actually be taken out of the premises. The business owner can ask someone to leave if the dog is not under control. However, the person at the business is only allowed to ask if the dog is a service animal, if it's required for a particular disability. So is it a service animal required for a particular disability? And what work or task does the dog do? What is it trained to perform? And there's no particular special training requirements. I've gotten this a lot because I actually use a guide dog at times, and people always ask, well, what kind of training did this, where did the dog get training? Do you have papers? There are no identification requirements, no certification requirements, and they don't have to be wearing anything in particular. That's something I get all the time. Well, your dog isn't wearing a cape, so it's not a service animal. That's not correct. A dog doesn't need to be wearing any particular regalia or any kind of garments or special equipment. It just needs to have, it needs to be trained, and you need to be able to explain how it's been trained. So, moving on to a little bit of how professionals can work with people with disabilities. We're all different people. We're all human, and we have different experiences that we learn from. We're all trying to help everyone, and we're all doing it through different lenses. We all have our own experiences and how we've grown up and the things that we've experienced in our lives. And I think about driving as one example. I've never driven before. And other than knowing the rules in theoretical ways, I have no concept of what that would be like, what it would be like to drive. I'd like to think I know what it would be like, but I don't know. So for me to be in charge of writing the rules of the road, it would be, it wouldn't be practical, because I want somebody who has been driving, And, if we're talking about a non-driving car, a self-driving car, I'm all about that. I can't wait to have one. But for now, I don't know the rules of the road, and it's not really my place to create them. And the same thing is true as we work together in society and work with people with disabilities, as we interact with each other. We don't know what someone's going through. We don't know what their experience has been. And the best people who can advise us are those who have lived in those experiences. So it's really most important to ask a person with a disability about their experience, and don't apply blanket rules to people with disabilities. I'm always getting a lot of assumptions about what blindness must mean and what blind people can do. Just because you've known a person with a disability doesn't mean you know exactly what to do when you meet someone with a disability. And every person with a disability has different preferences. So we have to ask each person what they prefer, just as you'd ask anybody else what they prefer. All right, is the top of this slide called for people with disabilities? All right. So as a person with a disability, each of us as a person with a disability is a consumer of a service. We all use different services, and you have the right to assert your preferences. If someone's treating you in a way that is not okay with you, and you feel it's because of your disability, you have the right to gently redirect them. If someone's not treating you respectfully, you can ask them how you'd like to be treated. Ask them to talk to you in a different way that maybe is more respectful of your disability. You don't have to just put up with it because you feel like people owe you something and, I have a disability, so I just have to do what they tell me. No, you're the one who knows your experience. It's not just professionals telling you what to do. Just like nobody gets to boss each other around without any kind of checks or balances, you know? Everybody has to learn what people prefer and what works for everyone. And what works for everyone is different. I get a lot of questions about language and disability identification. Every person with a disability has, like I said, different preferences about the terms that they use. So it's really best to ask them what they prefer. Like I said earlier, I'm blind, you know, I prefer that term. It's okay with me. I accept it. I embrace my disability. I'm not ashamed of it. I think a lot of people feel shame and pity when they think about disability, and it's really not necessary. I think majority of people with disabilities, while it may be inconvenient sometimes, while I wish I could just jump in the car today and drive wherever I want to go, I don't sit around feeling sorry for myself that I have a disability. And I don't think most people do. I think, sure, when you first get a disability and you're learning new skills and you're thinking, how the heck am I going to do this? Then you might feel a little pity for yourself at that time. But that's just how the process goes for anything. I mean, any sort of grieving process that you go through, you're going to feel sorry for yourself for some reason. And so that's like a natural thing. It doesn't have anything to do with disability itself. It just has to do with this process. And so some settings, particularly in professional settings, require you to use more politically correct language, you know, person with a disability. And some disabled people don't reject that. I'm okay with being called blind because I'm proud of it. I mean, maybe it's not what everybody would choose, and I, certainly didn't choose it, and like I said, it's inconvenient. But I'm not going to say I reject it or I don't accept it, because some people with disabilities prefer this person-first language. I'm a person who's blind or a person with a disability, and that's fine. But they want their personhood first and foremost, whereas I identify my personhood with my blindness, and that's okay with me. So it's just really important to talk to people about what they prefer, and it's okay to ask those questions. People embrace their identities differently. Like I said, I'm a blind. Some people say I am a Crip, and for some people that's very offensive to say that you're a Crip. But some people don't mind being called that or calling themselves that. It's really more about what they call themselves. They probably wouldn't like somebody to call them that. But, some people have that preference, some people don't. And there's a lot of this reclaiming what used to be negative terms, like I said, with the word Crip. This Crip the Vote is a new hashtag on Twitter and all over the internet, and it's embracing the fact that the disability community is the largest minority, and we have a huge voting power this election. And so we should be proud of that. We should be proud of what our disability can bring to the table and what information we can give people, what different perspectives we can give them. Because politicians don't necessarily think about disability until we ask them to, until we let them know what we want as people who are going to be voting. Some individuals with disabilities, like I said, have reclaimed the terms positively identified with their disabilities, and they're proud of it. They don't want anybody's pity. Some people find it offensive. So really you just have to ask them. You just have to have a conversation. Just don't make any, really the message is don't make any assumptions. I feel like I'm harping on this thing about language, but yeah, I already talked about the fact that I prefer being called blind or instead of visually impaired. I've heard some really weird language before. But like I said, everybody's unique. Bottom line, ask the questions. I don't think you're going to offend anybody by asking. And if you do, they'll tell you. They'll say, that was offensive to me. Are we on the ableism slide? Which I actually really spelled wrong. Sorry about that. So, ableism is a subtle or overt oppression of the lived experience of people with disabilities. So, just try to be aware of negative language. To say wheelchair bound, it kind of implies a prison where people with disabilities probably don't feel that they're living that kind of life or confined to a wheelchair. I think just be aware of that language. It just carries some negative messages that suggest that a wheelchair is a prison. And really, for many people, a wheelchair is their mode of independence. They get around, they move about, they travel all over the world. I think to an able-bodied person, they think that a wheelchair is a sign of helplessness, when really it doesn't have to be that. So it's more about putting yourself in that person's shoes and thinking about what would actually make them independent, I read this article about this teenager who ditched her wheelchair, which is fine, but it just claims she was more independent. I mean, she has the right to her opinion, of course. I can't tell her she's wrong for wanting to ditch her wheelchair. But the article suggested that she was more independent without it. And just because someone uses a wheelchair or has another impairment doesn't mean that they're less independent. I think that I'm probably more independent than anybody would know if they didn't know about blindness. They would probably think that I just sit at home and never leave my house. And that is very, very untrue. So just be mindful of assumptions that you carry into your interactions with people with disabilities. And here we go, assume nothing. I'm going to skip this because I think I've already beat a dead horse about assumptions. I think most people that begin interacting with me realize that their assumptions are wrong pretty quickly. More on assumptions. Be respectful. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Think about how a person can do something. Instead of thinking, oh, this person has a disability, they're just not able to do it, can't do it. Think about how it could happen. I was talking to a reporter on KGAN today about the ADA, and I was telling him about two doctors, one of whom is deaf, completely deaf, and one of whom is completely blind. Now, most people would say a doctor can't get through medical school without having sight. And he did it, and he did the whole thing. Sure, he had help. He had an assistant to help him do his surgeries, but he had to direct the assistant. He had to tell the assistant exactly what to do and where things were located, and then they were able to get through it together. So how can a person have meaningful community employment? How can we combine services to serve a person? You know, how can we do it? How can we collaborate? What jobs would this person be good at? What jobs would they enjoy? As far as helping people, it's really important to think about treating people with disabilities as you would treat anyone else. I've really been tempted to start wearing like a GoPro camera on my head and just walking around and like showing people how people treat me because it's really interesting. And I kind of want to do like a sociological, examination. It's really interesting how people kind of get tripped up, literally and figuratively. They might, jump over my cane because they're afraid I'm going to trip them. But also, they're tripped up mentally by my disability. They think, oh my God, what do I do? I have no idea what to do. And really, they just need to step back and think about it with a little common sense. What would you do with anybody else? How would you treat them? Would you grab a woman on the street if she were not blind? Would you do that? Would you intervene without being asked in other situations? And I understand that people are just trying to help, and I'm very mindful of that. So I'm not I don't snap at people when they come up and help me. But, what you might perceive as someone struggling might be something that they need to do in order to learn something. One of the examples of this is that when I'm using my cane or my guide dog, it's a tool to mapping the world around me. I can't build a map of things around me without making contact with them in some way. So I might have to hit my cane onto something in order to know that it's there. I have to find that, this park bench or something, or this other item. I need to know where it is so I can build this map in my head of what's around me. And so when a person yells out to me or grabs me to prevent my cane from touching it, it's kind of interfering with my ability to build that map that I need. And nobody would ever think of that. They would just be like, well, I don't want you to get hurt. I don't want you to hit that item. But it's an awareness activity. I really need to know where those things are. It's also true that if I'm holding someone's arm and walking through a place, I don't learn it as well because I'm not actually interacting with everything around me. So I'm just kind of walking through it without having to pay too much attention. So just be mindful. Don't grab a person or touch them without asking. Ask them if they need help. How can I help you? Do you need any help? How can I help you? Sorry? 2 pages too far. Back. Are we on resources?
I think the key is,
Does anybody have? Go ahead.
I think the key is listen to what the person's telling you. I have the experience often that someone wants to hold the door for me. Most of the time I can do it myself. If I can't, I will ask for the help. But if the person says no, You don't need to help me. Take no as the answer.
Yeah, I mean, I have an example of the door thing as well. If someone's holding a door for me, I don't necessarily know where it is. So then I have no point of reference of how to get through the door because I didn't actually touch it. I don't know where it is. And so, while I can listen to their voice and find out where they are, sometimes those things just make it a little more difficult when someone is actually trying to be helpful. And I try to educate, but really we have a minute or less to educate somebody about those things. And how can you get that point across? You probably can't. So it's just something that I continue educating about to let people know.
I have a question regarding language. So if we're interacting with one person, it's a little bit easier to ask preferred language. My daughter is autistic and she prefers the identity first language. She wants to be called autistic. But I'm actually a psychology professor, and so when I'm teaching about autism, I've been professionally trained to call an individual with autism, use that, person first. This is a person with autism. So when speaking to large groups or just educating the general public, do you have any advice for choosing which language to use?
If you're addressing mostly professionals, I would say person first language. I would say, I can't speak for the whole disability community, but in general, people with disabilities are more welcoming of identity first language. I think it is kind of a divide between the professional and the disability communities. Because I don't actually know who decided it was, I don't know who decided that person first language was better. And I don't believe it was a person with a disability. I could be completely wrong about that. I could be. And maybe that's important. That was important to someone, and maybe that did originate within the community. But I know in recent years, and maybe it's because of more acceptance of people with disabilities, it's less the thing to do. I mean, it's more it's okay to identify. And always there are going to be people who are having trouble identifying. It's a struggle. I mean, if I lost my vision today, if I were sighted and I lost my vision, I would have a lot more difficulty adjusting to that. And that's okay. But I think people come to a time when they've dealt with it for a while that they learn, what they prefer. It depends on your audience, really. I think I've done a good job of saying both today. I've kind of tried to do both, so maybe just divide it up. There are quite a few resources here. Job Accommodation Network, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. I can give these out later as well with the PowerPoint. We have quite a list here. And if anyone has any other questions, they can contact Disability Rights Iowa, whose contact information is here now on the screen. Our phone number is 515-278-2502, and there's a toll-free number, 800-779-2502. You can get to us on the web. We have a Facebook page. You can find all that at disabilityrightsiowa.org. And I'm glad to talk with anybody about any of these issues. I'm done well ahead of time. So I hope that you guys have questions or thoughts or any ways that I can improve my presentation. I know that I need to add pictures. I'm going to add more pictures next time. If you have thoughts about inclusion of other materials or other populations that I can address in the presentation, that would be very helpful. I just used a presentation we have been doing for quite a while and changed it a little bit to address some new issues.
We want to thank you very much for coming. Are there any more questions from the audience?
Hi, my name's Stephanie, and I have a question about children and schools and how we can better include children with disabilities in the activities of the school, in the after-school activities, after-school programs and that. A lot of times now they have to have a para to be with them to access programs where other children are getting enrichment. I'm wondering if you have any ideas of things we can do or should be doing with children that the law would suggest.
Certainly, schools should be providing access to those activities. I know that's one thing that the ADA and IDEA have improved. Of course, as you're saying right now, it's not perfect. But I know that when I was in school, there was no access to after-school programs because they were extracurricular, so they were not allowed, they were not accommodated. I do believe the school should provide some assistance with alternative formats. I am not personally aware of duties, and I would have to look this up, so I'm not going to give legal advice, but duties of the school to provide a para-educator or other type of assistant after school, although they should be finding some way to accommodate. So it could be perhaps a peer or a volunteer to help staff that. I don't know that they would provide paid access to those, depending on the hours. You know, if it was during school hours, they do have an obligation to make that accessible. I would have to do some case law research on whether they have to make it accessible if it's after the typical school day, and when that ends kind of depends on the school as well. You're welcome. Yeah, I would definitely be interested in that. That's something that Disability Rights Iowa would be interested in hearing about. I have been hearing there are experiences here in the local area with school districts that need some improvement as far as special education, so I would be interested in talking more about that offline.
Hi, this is Jim Throgmorton again. I taught urban planning for about 25 years. I'm a lover of maps, but almost all maps are two-dimensional, and I'm very conscious that we can't navigate the world in 2 dimensions. It's at least 3-dimensional. So when you were referring to your mental map, I became very curious. So I'm wondering, what do you really, quote, see when you're doing this mental mapping? You know, we're using your cane and so on.
So I try to keep track of the locations of different landmarks so that I know if I have been daydreaming and lost track of how many blocks I've walked, that there's this certain thing on this block. There's a tree at this part of the block, or there's a bench, or there's a bus shelter. I use a little bit of echolocation, which is not the crazy, amazing bat-sounding thing that you hear about on TV. It's nothing like that. But it does help. You can be walking by something, and your cane, as you're tapping your cane, it will make sound bounce off of different objects, and you can kind of hear, for example, the opening of a bus shelter sounds very distinctive. So you know that there's a bus shelter or some entryway there that you're passing. So I just kind of cobble those things together. And I actually love maps. And as a kid, the only way that I was able to learn about space eventually was that someone gave me access to tactile maps, which are basically topographical maps with lines that are raised up so you can feel how things are in space. Contrary to what most people would understand about a blind person, I'm a very visual learner. It helps me to know spatially where things are. For example, if I come in this room, I want to know exactly where everything is, and I kind of walked through and checked it out when I came in here, where things are located. And that helps me to navigate my world. I want to know where things are. I want to know what buildings are where. I want to know all the visual information I can get. Now, some blind people don't want any of that information. They don't care about the art. You know, they don't care about the pretty stuff around them. But I want to know all there is to know about the world around me, as far as maps and artistic things and colors and buildings and textures, and you know what's what spatially. And I really didn't get that until I started looking at tactile maps. And also today it would be now 3D printing. You could really easily print a 3D map with a 3D printer that would give a blind person an idea of a city block layout or a multi-block layout of a place. So the technology is really coming along in a way that's very positive. I'm really encouraged by it. That said, there's no replacement for walking through it. There's no replacement for good old skills. I mean, it's not just a technology world. You have to be able to walk through your environment and figure out where things are. You know, getting lost is part of my experience, and it's not a bad part. I think most people would panic if they were blind and got lost. I don't panic. It's a problem solving. It's like doing a puzzle. It's like, oh, I'm going to figure out where I'm at. Well, let me think. I hear train tracks. Oh, I can feel the sun on my forehead. I think I'm going west. You know, you just kind of learn. You just kind of figure your way around, and it's not as daunting as people would have you believing. Sure, it can be challenging, but definitely doable. And I love maps. So I appreciate city planning and all that goes into that. I'm encouraged. There are quite a few open source projects now that are using smartphones and computers to map out the location of different buildings and add extra information that would be available to blind people to be able to have more inclusive maps. I guess one example I can think of is if I'm using a GPS system. It's telling me to go west on a certain street, so I'm doing that, and then it's going to tell me to turn right. Well, it's going to tell me to turn right, but it's not going to tell me which corner my bus stop is on. So I know which way I'm supposed to go, but I don't necessarily know the exact location I'm looking for. And that's where all this extra data is very helpful in making maps more accessible. And that's true of not only blind people. Like I said earlier, things that you would do for one disability group are going to help another, and even non-disabled people, because there are people who have directional challenges who will benefit from these maps, and they don't necessarily identify as people with disabilities. So we have to be thinking more in those ways. People with Alzheimer's disease, people who have dementia, are directionally challenged in a different way, but they're going to benefit from things that we do for people with disabilities.
Anybody else?
I guess I would like to hear more of your bio.
Oh, sure.
You're from Iowa,
Okay.
so where? And
Sure,
where you
okay.
did your undergrad before you went to law?
Sure. Yeah, I grew up in Vermont. I was adopted. I weighed 1 pound 9 ounces when I was born, and I was not expected to live. And if I did live, I would have severe disabilities beyond blindness. By the way, I don't consider blindness a severe disability. Some might, but I don't. So I grew up in a family with 27 brothers and sisters, all adopted. And I was expected to pull my weight equally among all of them. So that means quite a bit of childcare and doing the dishes and doing housework. And I really appreciate those opportunities because later on in my life, I worked with blind youth, and many of them were extremely sheltered to the point where they could not do things for themselves. And I really was sad. I was very saddened by that because it meant that they were not getting the skills that they needed as children to grow up as a normal kid with normal responsibilities. And sure, we like to spoil our kids. We don't want to shoulder them with lots of responsibilities. But we do need to teach them basic skills. And the reality is that as a person with a disability, it may take a bit longer to learn those skills. So it's better to start earlier and get those skills ingrained early on. Grew up in Vermont with that large family, single mother, different siblings from all around the world, adopted from different places. I was very involved in sports, obviously individual sports. I did skiing, I did rollerblading around my neighborhood, I rode my bike around my neighborhood. I pretty much had the same level of vision I had, so I was just kind of daring. I didn't really let anything stop me. I did rock climbing, I was on the swim team. Like I said earlier, I wanted to go, actually no, I don't think I talked about this earlier, but I wanted to go into a diving class, and the instructor would not allow me to participate in the diving class because I was blind. So I ended up doing that anyway, but that was another story. Just did it anyway. Let's see. I went to public school all the way through. Some people go to schools for the blind or schools for other disability groups. I went to public school. I was fortunate to have a very good special ed team that worked with me on skills that I needed for blindness. So I would leave school part of the day to learn Braille and learn how to use a cane. But for the most part, I was in regular classes. I did struggle with not being able to participate in extracurricular activities. I really wanted to do debate team. And I couldn't do debate team because there was no way to put the materials into Braille at that time. It was not a covered part of the school day at that time. And there was no internet back then, so there wasn't any way to just look it up. Anymore, today, kids with disabilities have, although they still have many struggles, there's quite a bit of technology to help them in school in ways that are very creative. And that's something I'm looking forward to at Disability Rights Iowa. We now have an assistive technology team grant that will help us help others getting technologies that they need. If their insurance will not pay for their technology, then we can assist them. For the most part, schools would do that. Most of my technology growing up was provided by the school. But once you turn 18, that all goes back to the school. Or once you leave school. I guess not necessarily 18. You may be in school till you're 21. if you have a developmental disability. But once you leave school, you lose all of your technology, so it's very important to get them covered in other ways. I went to school in Vermont all the way through high school, and then I went to the University of Vermont for 2 years. I struggled at that school. I felt very isolated, didn't have a lot of friends. I transferred to be with some friends in Arkansas, so I went to the University of Arkansas. And somehow I began to be more accepted there. And I still haven't figured out what the change was. It might have been my attitude. Maybe I was less shy. In high school, I was very shy. I didn't talk to other people because I never knew who they were. Our interactions would be very limited. They would say hello, and I wouldn't know who they were, so I didn't talk to them because I couldn't interact. I didn't really know what to talk with them about. So as I got older, I got comfortable saying, "I'm sorry, I don't recognize your voice. Who are you?" And they would tell me, and then we could have a conversation. But that was a little awkward for a kid. I got a guide dog in college. That was a difficult experience because the dog didn't work out very well. So then I retired that dog after college, and I went to get training at a training center for the blind in Louisiana. And that's where I learned a lot of my just get up and go kind of attitude. At that program, you have to make a meal for 40 people at the end of your stay there by yourself. You have to go out, they drop you off in the middle of nowhere, and you have to find your way back. It's literally called blind boot camp, and it was the best thing I've ever done. Because once you do that, you're not afraid of things. You're not afraid to get lost. You're not afraid to cook. I mean, I don't like to cook, but I'm not afraid of it. You learn Braille, you learn computers, you learn just different skills to function in a sighted world. After that, I got a master's in public administration at the University of Utah, so I moved to Salt Lake. So I've kind of moved all over the country. I was there for 3 years, and then I came to Iowa to work for the Department for the Blind. I worked with transition age youth, and that's where I met a lot of the people that I felt had been done a disservice by helicopter parenting and overprotection because they really couldn't function on their own. Many of them, their paraprofessionals in school had done a lot of their work for them, so they didn't know, they were not very skilled academically. This is not everyone, this is just a generalization. They had difficulty in school, they had difficulty socializing because they'd been kind of sheltered at home. They hadn't gotten out and done things with their peers. And they didn't have a lot of job skills then. You know, when we start looking for jobs as kids, one of the things that we all do is to sort of explain how our life experiences would lend themselves to a job. You know, I did these things as a kid, I delivered papers, or I did dishes, or whatever the skill that you learned, you figure out how to make that into something that's positive for your future. Well, these kids didn't have those opportunities. A lot of them did not. Many of them did, but a lot of them did not. And it was just sad to see that their parents had been trying to do a good thing by sheltering them and really had not done such a good thing. So I really think it's important to let our kids with disabilities live a normal life and really get out there and experience it. Sure, we have fear of that. We have fear that they might get hurt. But that fear isn't any different than any other kid. Any kid can get hurt. Me getting hurt, I learned some lessons from getting hurt. You crash your bike a couple times, you're going to learn to be a little more careful. Everybody will. So it's really important to let them learn these things, even though it's scary as a parent. Let's see. After working with disabled youth for 3 years, I went back to law school so that I could become a disability rights advocate. And throughout law school, I worked in different disability-related firms and worked on assistive technology cases at the University of Iowa Law Clinic, where we helped people get technology that they needed. Just various experiences. I went to Berkeley, which is kind of the home of the independent living movement, so that was a very cool experience to go back to Berkeley, California, and see where it all began, basically. Back in the 60s, there were folks who everyone thought could never do much in their lives, and they went to school and they became involved in the government and really made changes for people with disabilities. So it was great to see that. Then after law school, I started working on special ed cases a little bit, and then I started working at Disability Rights Iowa this past January. So that's a relatively recent. I'm a recent law school grad and a recent attorney, and I primarily work on employment cases, but also housing. Actually, I work on a lot of areas, but primarily employment, getting people back to work, helping them figure out, what they need and making sure that they get accommodations. We also do voting issues, assistive technology, I do some special education cases, and cases involving mental illness and protection of individual rights. So that's basically anything else that doesn't fall under the others. And we have special categories for individuals with mental illness and individuals with developmental disabilities and individuals with brain injury, traumatic brain injury. So we serve a lot of these populations. We can't take every type of case. We don't take family issues like family law disputes. It has to be disability related, directly disability related.
I want to thank you very much for coming. We appreciate it. If you will, stay around for some questions people may have and talk with you. Over lunch, we discussed about the school board and the deficiencies that our special ed department has here. And one of the things, I and Stephanie here serve on the equity committee for the school board. And I've had parents call that want to know about it and want to come. Special ed falls under the equity committee. And so Disability Rights is taking on cases for people that feel that the law has been violated, and they can assist them in that. Correct?
Correct, and our services are free to the clients, so we don't charge anything.
I want to also mention a couple more things. One, I hope each one of us in this room can be an advocate for accessibility and for those persons with disabilities. We are not perfect in this world, but I can cite an example, not in our city, but in Coralville, of a brand new building that was built as a restaurant on the bottom floor, and on top it was a lounge for people to see over the river and stuff. Well, it had no way of access to the roof for people that had mobility issues. So I called the Justice Department because that's who handles complaints of this sort. It went for several years until early this year. I got a call from Washington from an attorney asking me about this. We talked at great length. They've investigated, and right now they're in litigation with that restaurant. And we're not sure what the outcome will be, either closing up that part of the restaurant or putting an elevator in. And after build elevator, it's very, very expensive. So I don't think they're going to go that route. But this is the sort of things we look at. We mentioned earlier the Library of the Blind. If you go to a restaurant, ask for a Braille menu. If they say I don't have one, tell the manager that the Library of the Blind in our state will provide 2 free menus. All they have to do is send those menus to them, and in a few weeks they'll get 2 free back. That's a small thing, but we want to do it. 2 projects I want to make you aware of. I apologize for working my computer. I was on a tight schedule today to get a grant in. We've applied for a grant through ID Action for voter registration and voting for persons with disabilities. I've been working with the city and the county, both. The city has agreed on the election day that anybody with a disability will have free fare. They will not have to pay. Those that need to take seats buses, that's where the grant's going, hopefully, if we get it. I'll know next week. So we're going to need volunteers because one of the things we envision is having volunteers at the precincts, at the polling places, to assist, one, for registration, because when the bus comes up, we'll just go out there, register them, and they can go in and vote. And they may need help voting, and that we will have training for this. So if you're interested, let me know. The second project that we are doing is citywide. It has support from the Downtown Business Association, I believe the city. Yes. We're, a friend of mine and I, Jeffrey Ford, who's a bilateral amputee, were talking over lunch one day about the inaccessibility of a lot of the restaurants in this community. Well, we can't do a lot to change that right at this point. But what we can do is recognize those restaurants that are accessible. And so we are working with the university and getting a team of graduate students that will be trained to go into the restaurants. And by the way, 325 restaurants, I've been told, from the Downtown Business Association are in the downtown area and towards the north and south side. We're going to need people to volunteer to help us put this together, to be trained themselves to go to the restaurants. If a restaurant passes the audit, they'll get a sticker to put on their door, and they'll also go on a web page that we'll be building, which will indicate these are accessible restaurants. And if you press on that link there, it'll go to the restaurant site and has a menu available. Unfortunately, not in Braille computers. Other than that, please make sure you've signed in so we can keep in touch with you and give you more information as we get it. If you're interested in these projects, please see me before you leave today. I want to thank you all for coming, and please help us.
You're watching City Channel 4. On TV, online, on demand, on Facebook, and now on the go on your mobile device.